We're just days away from reaching 1,000 subscribers. If we hit this goal in the next 15 days, we'll be able to keep the channel running and continue bringing you these stories. Your subscription makes all the difference. It's quick and helps us enormously. The Colonel's Protection. Chapter 1. The Occupied Town. The autumn of 1863 had settled over the small Georgia town of Millhaven like a shroud, bringing with it the harsh realities of war and occupation. Union forces under Colonel James Nathaniel Hartwell had taken control of the town 3 weeks prior, establishing their camp in the town square and requisitioning buildings for military use. The stars and bars no longer flew over the courthouse. In its place, the stars and stripes snapped in the October wind, a constant reminder to the Confederate sympathizers that their world had changed forever. Colonel Hartwell, at 38, was a career military man from Massachusetts who had distinguished himself at Gettysburg and Antietam. Tall and lean, with prematurely graying hair and piercing blue eyes, he commanded respect through competence rather than bluster. Unlike some Union officers who viewed the occupied South as conquered territory to be plundered, Hartwell maintained strict discipline among his men and insisted on treating civilians with what dignity the circumstances of war allowed. It was this commitment to military discipline that had brought him to the modest white cottage on Elm Street on this particular morning. Reports had reached him that some of his soldiers had been harassing the local widows, taking advantage of their vulnerability to demand tributes of food, personal items, and worse. Such behavior was not only disgraceful, but threatened the fragile peace he was trying to maintain in Millhaven. The cottage belonged to Mrs. Catherine Elizabeth Beaumont, widow of Captain Thomas Beaumont of the 21st Georgia Infantry, killed at Chancellorsville 5 months earlier. At 26, she was left alone to care for her 8-year-old daughter Sarah and manage what remained of her late husband's modest estate. Like many Confederate widows, she found herself caught between her loyalty to the cause her husband had died for and the practical necessity of surviving under Union occupation. Colonel Hartwell knocked firmly but politely on the front door, removing his cap as footsteps approached from within. The door opened to reveal a woman of striking beauty, though her loveliness was marred by obvious exhaustion and worry. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a simple bun, and her black mourning dress, while clean and mended, showed the wear of hard use. But it was her face that caught his attention immediately, specifically the fading yellow bruise along her left cheekbone and the way she instinctively touched her right wrist, as if it pained her. "Mrs. Beaumont, I presume," he said courteously. "I am Colonel Hartwell, commanding the Union forces in Millhaven. I wonder if I might speak with you for a few moments." Catherine's green eyes flashed with a mixture of fear and defiance. "If you've come to requisition more of my property, Colonel, I must tell you there's precious little left to take." "I haven't come to take anything, ma'am. Rather, I've come because I've heard disturbing reports about the conduct of some of my soldiers. May I come in?" She hesitated, clearly reluctant to invite a Union officer into her home, but recognizing she had little choice in the matter. "Very well, but please keep your voice down. My daughter is resting upstairs. She's been unwell." Colonel Hartwell entered the modest parlor, noting the faded but once fine furniture and the obvious efforts Catherine had made to maintain some semblance of genteel living despite her reduced circumstances. A portrait of a young man in Confederate gray hung above the mantelpiece, undoubtedly her late husband. "Mrs. Beaumont," he began, "I'll speak plainly. I've received reports that some of my men have been inappropriate in their dealings with the ladies of the town. If you've experienced any such difficulties, I need to know about it immediately." Catherine stiffened, her hand again moving unconsciously to her wrist. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean, Colonel." "Ma'am, with respect, the bruise on your face suggests otherwise." His voice was gentle but firm. "I can see that someone has struck you recently. I can also see that you're favoring your right wrist. If one of my soldiers has laid hands on you, I assure you he will face the full consequences of military justice." "It wasn't," Catherine began, then stopped herself, biting her lip. The kindness in the Union colonel's voice was unexpected, and for a moment her carefully maintained composure wavered. "Mrs. Beaumont," Colonel Hartwell said quietly, "I know we are on opposite sides of this conflict. I know you have every reason to distrust me and my men, but I give you my word as an officer and a gentleman that any soldier under my command who has abused you will be held accountable." Catherine studied his face, searching for signs of deception or hidden agenda. What she saw instead was genuine concern, and something she had almost forgotten existed: honor. Still, loyalty and pride warred with her desperate need for protection. "Colonel," she said finally, "even if what you suspect were true, what would be the point of reporting it? I am a Confederate widow in an occupied town, my word against that of a Union soldier." "Your word would be enough for me," he said simply. "Mrs. Beaumont, I have a sister your age back in Boston. If I thought someone was laying hands on her while she was defenseless, I would want every decent man within reach to come to her aid. The fact that we wear different uniforms doesn't change that obligation." At that moment, footsteps sounded on the stairs, and a small voice called out, "Mama, who's here?" Catherine's face immediately filled with maternal concern. "It's all right, Sarah, just a visitor. Stay upstairs, darling." But the child was already at the bottom of the stairs, peering around the corner with curious blue eyes. She was a miniature version of her mother, with the same auburn curls and delicate features, though her cheeks were pale and her small frame too thin. "Good afternoon, Miss Sarah," Colonel Hartwell said, offering the child a respectful bow. "I'm Colonel Hartwell." Sarah looked from her mother to the Union officer with the solemn wisdom that war often forced upon children too young to understand it. "Are you here to arrest Mama?" The question hit both adults like a physical blow. Catherine quickly moved to her daughter's side, and Colonel Hartwell felt something twist in his chest at the child's matter-of-fact acceptance of such a possibility. "No, sweetheart," he said gently. "I'm here to make sure your mother is safe. That's all." "From the bad soldiers?" Sarah asked innocently. The words hung in the air like an accusation. Catherine went pale, and Colonel Hartwell felt a cold fury building in his chest. The child's casual reference to bad soldiers told him everything he needed to know about what had been happening in this house. "Sarah," Catherine said quickly, "go back upstairs. Now." But Colonel Hartwell knelt down to the child's level, his voice remaining gentle despite the anger radiating from his every pore. "Sarah, which soldiers were bad to you and your mama?" "James," Catherine warned, but the colonel's steady gaze never left the child. "The loud one with the red beard," Sarah said matter-of-factly. "He makes Mama cry. And he broke her lamp." "Sarah, that's enough," Catherine said firmly, but her voice shook. Colonel Hartwell stood slowly, his face having gone deadly calm. "Mrs. Beaumont, I believe we need to have a more detailed conversation. Sarah, would you like to go pick some flowers in the back garden while your mother and I talk?" The child nodded and skipped away, leaving the two adults alone with the weight of what had just been revealed. "Sergeant Murphy," Colonel Hartwell said quietly. "Redbeard, loud voice, 3rd Company, am I correct?" Catherine said nothing, but her silence was answer enough. "Mrs. Beaumont, I'm going to ask you one more time. What has Sergeant Murphy done to you?" Catherine closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, there were tears there. "He comes by every few days, demanding food, demanding payment for protection. When I told him I had nothing left to give, he He said there were other ways I could show my gratitude for Union generosity. Colonel Hartwell's hands clenched into fists at his sides, and when you refused, he struck me, twisted my wrist, said that Confederate widows couldn't afford to be too proud. Her voice was barely a whisper. Colonel, please understand, I was afraid. If I complained, what would stop him from doing worse? What would protect Sarah? I will, Colonel Hartwell said with quiet intensity. From this moment forward, Mrs. Beaumont, you and your daughter are under my personal protection, and Sergeant Murphy. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the cold promise of justice. Sergeant Murphy is about to learn what happens when soldiers under my command forget what it means to be honorable men. What Colonel Hartwell did next would indeed silence the entire camp and serve as a reminder that even in the midst of civil war, there were still men who understood that some lines should never be crossed. Chapter 2. Military Justice. Within an hour of leaving the Beaumont cottage, Colonel Hartwell had summoned his senior staff to his headquarters in the requisitioned courthouse. Major Robert Sterling, Captain William Hayes, and Lieutenant Thomas Crawford stood at attention before their commanding officer's desk, noting the dangerous calm that had settled over the colonel like the stillness before a thunderstorm. "Gentlemen," Colonel Hartwell began, his voice deceptively quiet, "we have a serious problem. It has come to my attention that one of our non-commissioned officers has been engaging in conduct that brings disgrace upon this regiment and the United States Army." Major Sterling, a grizzled veteran who had served with Hartwell since the Peninsula Campaign, shifted uncomfortably. "What kind of conduct, sir?" "The kind that involves threatening and striking defenseless women, Major. The kind that exploits military authority to extort favors from civilian widows." Each word was delivered with the precision of a rifle shot. "I'm speaking specifically of Sergeant Patrick Murphy of 3rd Company." The officers exchanged glances. Murphy was known throughout the regiment as a hard-drinking Irishman from New York's 5 Points. Tough as nails in battle, but with a reputation for being heavy-handed with civilians. Most had looked the other way, considering such behavior an unfortunate but inevitable consequence of occupation duty. "Sir," Captain Hayes ventured carefully, "Murphy's been with the regiment since Bull Run. He's a good soldier in a fight." "A good soldier," Colonel Hartwell interrupted, "does not prey upon women and children. A good soldier does not use his rank and authority to terrorize those we are sworn to protect." "Protect?" Lieutenant Crawford looked confused. "But, sir, these are Confederate sympathizers, enemy civilians." Colonel Hartwell fixed the young officer with a stare that made him take an involuntary step backward. "Lieutenant, the women and children of this town may support the Confederacy in their hearts, but they are still non-combatants. They are still human beings, deserving of basic dignity and protection. When we allow our soldiers to abuse them, we become no better than common brigands." "What exactly has Murphy done?" Major Sterling asked. "He has been systematically extorting Mrs. Catherine Beaumont, widow of a Confederate captain. When she could no longer meet his demands for food and tribute, he struck her and threatened to take payment in other forms. This occurred in front of her 8-year-old daughter. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Even the most hardened veterans among them had daughters, sisters, wives at home." "Jesus," Captain Hayes muttered, "that goes beyond the pale." "Indeed it does," Colonel Hartwell agreed grimly. "Major Sterling, have Sergeant Murphy arrested immediately and confined pending court-martial. Captain Hayes, I want you to conduct a full investigation into the conduct of all our personnel towards civilian women. Any other incidents of abuse are to be reported to me personally." "Yes, sir," both officers responded. "Lieutenant Crawford, You will establish a guard rotation for the Beaumont residents, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Mrs. Beaumont and her daughter are now under my personal protection." "Sir," Lieutenant Crawford said hesitantly, "the men might not understand why we're protecting a Confederate widow." "Then you will make them understand, Lieutenant. You will explain that we are United States Army soldiers, not thugs. You will explain that our cause is just precisely because we stand for something better than the barbarism that slavery represents. We cannot claim moral authority if we ourselves behave without honor." Within the hour, word had spread throughout the camp that Sergeant Murphy had been arrested on charges of conduct unbecoming, assault upon a civilian, and extortion. The soldiers gathered in small groups, talking in hushed tones about this unprecedented turn of events. Many of them had witnessed or participated in similar requisitions from Confederate families, considering it spoils of war. Murphy himself was dragged from the tavern where he'd been drinking away his last pay, his red face flushed with alcohol and indignation. "This is horse shit," he bellowed, as two corporals marched him toward the makeshift stockade. "She's just some rebel bitch. Since when do we coddle traitors?" His protests were cut short when Colonel Hartwell appeared, flanked by his staff. The assembled soldiers fell silent, sensing that something significant was about to occur. "Sergeant Murphy," the colonel said, his voice carrying clearly across the camp, "you stand accused of conduct unbecoming a non-commissioned officer of the United States Army. Specifically, you are charged with assault upon a civilian woman, extortion, and bringing disgrace upon your regiment and your country." Murphy's bloodshot eyes narrowed. "She tell you that? That lying Confederate whore." The words had barely left his mouth before Colonel Hartwell struck him across the face with such force that the sergeant staggered and fell to his knees. A collective gasp went up from the watching soldiers. They had never seen their commanding officer lay hands on anyone in anger. "You will address Mrs. Beaumont with respect," Colonel Hartwell said, his voice deadly calm despite the violence of his action. "She is a lady, and you will speak of her as such, or you will not speak at all." Murphy spat blood and glared up at the colonel. "A lady? She's the widow of a rebel captain. Her husband was probably at Antietam, shooting at our boys. Her husband was a soldier, doing his duty as he saw it, just as we do ours. That gives us no right to abuse his widow." Colonel Hartwell turned to address the assembled troops. "Men, let me make something crystal clear. We are not occupying this town to terrorize women and children. We are here to restore the Union and to prove that our cause represents something noble and just." He paused, letting his gaze sweep over the faces before him. "When we abuse defenseless civilians, when we exploit our position of power to harm those who cannot defend themselves, we betray everything our fallen comrades died for. We become the very tyranny we claim to fight against." Private Daniel Walsh, barely 18 and far from his Massachusetts farm, raised his hand tentatively. "But, sir, they hate us. They want us dead. Why should we protect them?" It was a fair question, one that many of the soldiers had been thinking, but hadn't dared voice. "Private Walsh," Colonel Hartwell replied, "hatred is precisely why we must choose to be better. Mrs. Beaumont lost her husband to this war, a husband she loved, fighting for a cause she believed in. She has every reason to hate us. But if we prove ourselves to be honorable men, if we show her that Yankees can be decent and just, perhaps we can win something more valuable than military victory. Perhaps we can win the peace that will follow." He gestured toward Murphy, still kneeling in the dirt. Sergeant Murphy chose to confirm every negative belief Mrs. Beaumont had about Union soldiers. He proved to her that we are exactly the brutal invaders Confederate propaganda claims us to be. In doing so, he made reunion harder, not easier. Major Sterling stepped forward. "What are your orders regarding punishment, sir?" Colonel Hartwell was quiet for a long moment, considering. Military law gave him broad discretion in dealing with disciplinary matters during wartime. "Sergeant Murphy will be stripped of his rank and reduced to private," he announced. "He will serve 30 days in confinement on bread and water. Upon completion of his sentence, he will be transferred to another unit, one where his particular talents might be better utilized in direct combat rather than occupation duty. And if he commits similar offenses elsewhere," Captain Hayes asked quietly. "Then he will face a firing squad," Colonel Hartwell replied matter-of-factly, "because a soldier who cannot control himself around defenseless women is no soldier at all. He's a criminal in uniform." The assembled troops absorbed this in silence. Many of them had grown careless in their treatment of Confederate civilians, thinking such behavior was expected or even encouraged. The colonel's words and his swift, decisive action made clear that a new standard would be enforced. "Dismissed," Colonel Hartwell ordered. As the soldiers dispersed, talking quietly among themselves, Major Sterling approached his commanding officer. "Sir, if I may say so, that was necessary. But it's going to cause talk. Some of the men might question whether you're being too soft on Confederate sympathizers." Colonel Hartwell looked toward the direction of the Beaumont cottage, where he knew a young widow was trying to explain to her daughter why soldiers she had been taught to fear were now standing guard outside their home. "Let them question, Major," he said quietly. "A man who would abuse a defenseless woman is no man at all, and an army that tolerates such behavior is no army worthy of preserving the Union." That evening, as news of the day's events spread through Millhaven, Confederate sympathizers and Union soldiers alike found themselves grappling with a new reality, one where honor mattered more than politics and where justice could emerge from the most unlikely source. Chapter 3. Unexpected Understanding. 3 weeks had passed since Sergeant Murphy's public disgrace and transfer, and the atmosphere in Millhaven had subtly shifted. The Union soldiers, now under strict orders regarding their treatment of civilians, conducted themselves with newfound restraint. The Confederate sympathizers among the townspeople, while still resentful of the occupation, began to grudgingly admit that Colonel Hartwell ran a disciplined command that respected certain boundaries. For Catherine Beaumont, these weeks had brought an unexpected respite from fear. The guard rotation that Colonel Hartwell had established meant that she and Sarah could sleep safely for the first time in months. More surprisingly, the colonel himself had taken to stopping by every few days, ostensibly to check on their welfare. But increasingly, Catherine suspected, for reasons that had little to do with military duty. On this particular autumn afternoon, Catherine was hanging laundry in her small back garden when she heard Sarah's delighted laughter from the front yard. Moving to investigate, she found her daughter engaged in an animated conversation with Colonel Hartwell, who was kneeling in the dirt beside a wooden toy soldier that had apparently suffered some battle damage. "You see," the colonel was explaining seriously to the 8-year-old, "a good commanding officer never leaves a fallen soldier behind. Even if he's just wooden, he deserves proper medical attention." Sarah giggled as the colonel carefully straightened the toy's bent arm. "Mama says my papa was a good commanding officer too. He took care of his soldiers." "I'm sure he was," Colonel Hartwell replied gently. "Taking care of those under your command is the most important duty any officer has." Catherine felt a familiar tightness in her chest at the mention of Thomas. Even after 5 months, grief could still catch her unexpectedly. But watching this Union colonel, this enemy, treat her daughter with such patient kindness stirred complicated emotions she wasn't prepared to examine. "Colonel Hartwell," she called, stepping onto the front porch. "You're becoming quite the regular visitor. Won't your soldiers think you're neglecting your duties?" He stood and brushed the dirt from his knees, his blue eyes meeting hers with that steady gaze she had come to recognize. My duties include ensuring the welfare of all persons under military protection, Mrs. Beaumont. Besides, Sarah here has been educating me about the proper care and feeding of toy soldiers, knowledge that may prove invaluable to my military career. Mamma, can Colonel Hartwell stay for dinner? Sarah asked with the innocent directness that made adults squirm. He brought me peppermints and he knows lots of stories about soldiers. Catherine felt heat rise in her cheeks. Sarah, Colonel Hartwell is a very busy man. I'm sure he has more important things to do than— Actually, the Colonel interrupted quietly, I would be honored to accept if it wouldn't be an imposition. I confess that military rations grow tiresome, and I hear you make exceptional cornbread. There was something in his tone, a loneliness that echoed her own, that made Catherine's refusal die on her lips. Very well, but I should warn you, our meals have become quite simple since the war reduced your circumstances, he finished gently. Mrs. Beaumont, I didn't come expecting a feast. I came hoping for the company of civilized people who might help me remember what we're fighting to preserve. An hour later, they sat around Catherine's small dining table, an intimate grouping that would have scandalized Confederate and Union loyalists alike. Sarah chatted happily about her lessons and her dolls, while Catherine found herself studying their guest with unwilling fascination. Stripped of his military bearing and formal uniform coat, Colonel Hartwell seemed younger, less formidable. He spoke knowledgeably about literature and music, asked thoughtful questions about Sarah's education, and treated both females with a courtesy that never felt condescending. It had been so long since Catherine had engaged in civilized conversation with a man that she almost forgot he was supposed to be her enemy. Mrs. Beaumont, the Colonel said, as Sarah excused herself to fetch her favorite book to show him. May I ask you something personal? Catherine tensed, her guard going up. You may ask. Whether I answer depends on the question. What was your husband like? As a man, I mean, not as a soldier. The question caught her off guard. She had expected something more intrusive, more military in nature. Why do you want to know? Because I see his influence in how you've raised your daughter, in the grace with which you've borne your hardships. I find myself curious about the kind of man who could inspire such devotion. Catherine was quiet for a moment, then spoke softly. Thomas was gentle, scholarly, actually. He was a teacher before the war, loved poetry and philosophy. He never wanted to be a soldier, but when Georgia seceded, he felt he had a duty to serve. She looked up at the Colonel. I imagine you find that ironic, a reluctant Confederate fighting against the Union. Not ironic, Colonel Hartwell replied. Tragic. Some of the finest men I've known in this war have been fighting for the other side. Honor and courage aren't exclusively Northern virtues, Mrs. Beaumont. You speak as if you knew him. In a way, I did. I've known many men like him, good men caught up in causes larger than themselves, doing what they believe is right even when it costs them everything. He paused, then added quietly, I was at Chancellorsville, Mrs. Beaumont. I may have been there when your husband fell. The words hung heavy in the air between them. Catherine felt the world tilt slightly, as if she were looking down a great distance at something she couldn't quite comprehend. You were there, she whispered. You saw. I saw brave men die on both sides, he said gently. Men who loved their wives and children, who believed they were protecting everything they held dear. The only difference was the color of their uniforms. Sarah returned then, breaking the moment's intensity with her cheerful chatter about the book she wanted to share. But Catherine found herself looking at Colonel Hartwell with new eyes, seeing not just the Union officer who had protected her, but a man who carried his own weight of grief and responsibility. Later, as the Colonel prepared to leave, Catherine walked him to the front gate, while Sarah said goodnight to the guards who had become like familiar uncles to her. Colonel, Catherine said quietly, may I ask you something personal now? Of course. Why do you really come here? And please don't tell me it's just military duty." He was quiet for a long moment, his hands resting on the gate between them. "Because," he said finally, "in this house, I remember what peace feels like. In your company and Sarah's, I can almost forget that I've spent 3 years watching good men die for principles that seem increasingly distant from the reality of human suffering." "You're lonely," Catherine said with sudden understanding. "We're all lonely, Mrs. Beaumont. This war has isolated us from everything we once held dear. But yes, I find that the company of a lady who values books and kindness over politics and hatred, it reminds me of the man I was before I learned to kill efficiently." Catherine studied his profile in the lamplight from her parlor window. "Colonel, you do realize what people will say if you continue visiting here, a Union officer and a Confederate widow." "Let them say what they will," he replied firmly. "I've discovered something in these past weeks, Mrs. Beaumont. I've discovered that honor and decency matter more to me than public opinion or military advancement. And I've discovered that some connections transcend the uniforms we wear." "What kind of connections?" Catherine asked, though her heart was already whispering the answer. "The kind that make a man hope this war will end soon," he said quietly, "so that two people who found understanding in the midst of madness might discover what else they could build together." With that, he touched his cap in salute and walked away, leaving Catherine to stand at her gate with her heart racing and her carefully constructed world of loyalties and certainties crumbling around her. The Confederate widow and the Union colonel had found something neither had expected in the midst of civil war, the possibility of love strong enough to bridge the divide that was tearing their nation apart. Chapter 4. Love in the Time of War. Winter had come early to Georgia in 1864, and with it news that would change everything for the small town of Millhaven. General Sherman was marching toward Atlanta, and all Union forces were being recalled to join the advance. Colonel Hartwell had received orders to move his regiment north within the week, leaving the town to whatever Confederate forces might reoccupy it. The news hit Catherine like a physical blow. Over the months since Murphy's disgrace, she had grown to depend not just on the colonel's protection, but on his presence in her life. Their dinner conversations had become a cherished ritual, their discussions of books and philosophy a bright spot in the darkness of war. More troubling still was the realization that her feelings for the Yankee colonel had grown far beyond gratitude or friendship. On his final evening in Millhaven, Colonel Hartwell came to dinner carrying a package wrapped in brown paper and string. Sarah, now 9 and devoted to her mother's mysterious suitor, clapped her hands in delight. "Is it a present?" "What is it?" "Something for your mother," the colonel said gently. "But first, Sarah, I need to speak with you about something important." The child's face grew serious. "Are you going away?" "Yes, sweetheart. My soldiers and I have been ordered to march north. We'll be leaving tomorrow morning." Sarah's lower lip trembled. "But who will protect us from the bad soldiers?" Catherine felt her heart break as she watched her daughter's world crumble once again. In the space of 2 years, Sarah had lost her father, her security, and now the man who had become a protective figure in her young life. "Sarah," Colonel Hartwell said, kneeling to her level, "there won't be any more soldiers here after we leave. The town will be peaceful again. And your mama is very brave and very smart. She'll take good care of you. But what if the bad soldiers come back?" "They won't," he said firmly. "I give you my word. And Sarah, I want you to take care of this for me." He removed his colonel's insignia from his uniform and pressed it into her small hand. "This is very important. It means you're in charge of watching over your mother while I'm gone." Sarah clutched the golden eagle to her chest, as if it were the most precious thing in the world. "Will you come back?" "If God wills it, and this war ever ends, then yes, I'll come back." After Sarah had been tucked into bed, Catherine and the Colonel sat in her parlour before the fire, the wrapped package between them on the small table. Neither spoke for several minutes, both knowing that words would make the approaching farewell too real. "What's in the package?" Catherine finally asked. "Open it and see." With trembling fingers, she untied the string and folded back the paper to reveal a leather-bound volume of poetry, Tennyson's In Memoriam. Inside the front cover, in his precise handwriting, was an inscription: "For Catherine, whose grace in sorrow has taught me that love can bloom even in winter's heart. With all my devotion, James." "James," she whispered, using his given name for the first time. "I can't accept this. It's too personal. Too intimate for a Union colonel to give a Confederate widow." He moved from his chair to sit beside her on the sofa, close enough that she could smell the sandalwood soap he used, close enough to see the flecks of gold in his blue eyes. "Catherine, we've moved far beyond the proprieties that should govern such relationships." "Have we?" she asked softly. "What are we, James? What have we become?" "I don't know what to call it," he admitted. "I only know that somewhere between protecting you from Murphy and sharing quiet dinners in your parlour, I've fallen in love with you. Completely, irrevocably, hopelessly in love." Catherine closed her eyes, tears spilling over. "Don't say that. Please don't make this harder than it already is." "Why not?" "Because you're a Confederate widow and I'm a Union officer. Because your neighbors would call you a traitor and mine would call me a fool." He gently took her hands in his. "Catherine, look at me." She opened her eyes to find him gazing at her with such tenderness that her breath caught. "I love you," he said simply. "I love your courage and your intelligence and the way you've raised Sarah to be kind despite all the cruelty she's witnessed. I love the way you read Wordsworth aloud and the way you hum while you work in the garden. I love that you can discuss military strategy and then cry over a broken bird's wing." "James," she whispered, "marry me, Catherine." The words hung between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. Catherine stared at him in shock. "Marry you? How could we possibly? The war, our opposing loyalties. The war won't last forever, and loyalty to abstract causes matters less than loyalty to the people we love." He reached into his coat and withdrew a simple gold band. "This was my mother's. She would have loved you, Catherine. She would have understood that love doesn't recognize political boundaries." Catherine looked at the ring, then at the man offering it. Everything logical in her mind screamed that this was impossible, impractical, potentially dangerous. But her heart, her wounded, carefully guarded heart, recognized something it had thought lost forever: the possibility of happiness. What would we do? Where would we go? After the war, I'll resign my commission. We could go west to California or Oregon Territory. Somewhere we could start fresh, where no one knows or cares about blue uniforms or grey ones. His voice grew urgent. "Catherine, I know I'm asking you to trust in an uncertain future. I know I'm asking you to leave everything familiar. But I'm also offering you my protection, my love, and a life where you'd never have to fear or want for anything again. And Sarah would become my daughter in every way that matters. I'd love her and protect her as if she were my own blood." Catherine thought of the months of kindness he'd shown them both, the way Sarah's face lit up when he arrived, the peace she felt in his presence. Then she thought of the alternative, a future of uncertainty, poverty, and the constant struggle of a widow alone in a war-torn world. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, yes, James. I'll marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that shook slightly, then kissed her with a passion that spoke of months of restrained longing. When they finally broke apart, both were crying. "How will we manage it? The ceremony, I mean." Tomorrow morning, before we march, the regimental chaplain will perform the service. It won't be the wedding you dreamed of as a girl. It will be perfect, Catherine said firmly, because it will be ours. The next morning, as the Union regiment prepared to march north toward Sherman's army, a small group gathered in the courthouse. Catherine in her best dress with wildflowers in her hair, Sarah clutching her colonel's insignia like a talisman, Major Sterling and Captain Hayes as witnesses, and Chaplain Morrison with his worn Bible. The ceremony was brief but meaningful, the vows spoken with quiet intensity by two people who understood they were defying not just social convention, but the very forces tearing their nation apart. When Chaplain Morrison pronounced them husband and wife, James kissed his bride, while Sarah cheered and the assembled soldiers applauded. For a moment, the divisions of war seemed to fade before the simple power of love triumphant. As the regiment began its march, Catherine and Sarah stood at the town limits, watching the blue column disappear into the winter morning. Catherine wore James's ring on her finger and his promise in her heart that he would survive the war and return to claim his family. "Mama," Sarah asked, "will Colonel Hartwell really come back?" Catherine touched the ring, thinking of the man who had seen bruises on a Confederate widow and chosen to offer protection instead of exploitation, love instead of conquest. "Yes, darling," she said with quiet conviction. "He'll come back. Good men always find their way home." And in the spring of 1865, when the war finally ended and the guns fell silent, Colonel James Hartwell did indeed return to claim his wife and daughter, proving that sometimes love could triumph over even the deepest divisions, and that honor could bridge any gap between enemies who chose to see each other's humanity.